Robert Bobby Martinez was 65 years old with 35 years of experience when the young CEO Brian Caldwell called him into his office that cold Monday morning in November. The Phoenix Metro Transit Maintenance Facility had been his home for more than 3 decades. His weathered hands knew every bolt, every belt, every secret of those diesel engines that transported thousands of Phoenix residents every day. But that morning, with a cold smile and a dismissive look, Brian told him it was time to step aside for younger workers, that his age represented a liability for the company, that his last day would be Friday. Bobby walked out of that office with the dignity of someone who had worked honestly his entire life, but with a broken heart. What Brian didn't know was that he was about to make the most costly mistake of his career. Because 6 months later, when Phoenix Metro Transit's accounts were deep in the red and clients were fleeing to the competition, Robert Martinez would return, not as a humiliated employee, not as a beggar, but as majority partner of the company. And the truth about how he did it would shake the foundations of everything Brian believed he knew about success and respect. The Phoenix Metro Transit Maintenance Facility in Tempe woke up every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, with the sound of rolling doors and the rumble of the first buses entering for routine maintenance. Bobby Martinez was always the first to arrive, at 5:45, with his thermos of coffee and his blue coveralls now faded but impeccably clean. 65 years old, silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, Bobby was a living legend in that facility. He had started as an apprentice in 1988, when Phoenix Metro Transit was still a small family business with only 15 buses. Now, 35 years later, the fleet had 200 vehicles serving the entire Phoenix metropolitan area, and Bobby knew every single bus like they were his children. Colleagues called him the Professor for his ability to diagnose problems that other mechanics couldn't even identify. He just had to listen to the engine for 30 seconds to understand what was wrong. His hands, though marked by age and decades of hard work, were still the most precise in the entire facility. But 6 months earlier, Phoenix Metro Transit had been acquired by a large investment group. The old owner, Mike Sullivan, who had always treated Bobby like a brother, had retired. In his place came Brian Caldwell, 36 years old, MBA from Stanford, designer suits, and no real experience in the transportation sector. Brian had brought with him an obsession with numbers, productivity charts, and optimizations. He started walking around the facility with a tablet in hand, taking notes, asking invasive questions, looking at the older mechanics with a mix of skepticism and annoyance. That November morning, Bobby was working under bus number 147, an old 2010 Gillig that had a recurring transmission problem. He was the only mechanic who could fix it without having to replace the entire system, saving the company thousands of dollars each time. He was adjusting a particularly stubborn joint when he heard Brian's voice echoing through the facility. One of Brian's assistants approached Bobby with an embarrassed look, saying the CEO wanted to see him immediately in his office. Bobby wiped his hands with a rag, removed his gloves, and crossed the facility, feeling the worried looks of his colleagues. Brian's office was on the 2nd floor, with large windows overlooking the facility. It had been completely renovated. Hardwood floors, designer desk, leather chairs. Nothing like Mike's old office, full of vintage bus posters and company soccer tournament trophies. Brian was sitting behind the desk, eyes fixed on the computer. He didn't even look up when Bobby entered. He made him wait standing for a good 2 minutes, a power play that Bobby immediately recognized but endured in silence. When Brian finally spoke, his words fell like stones in water. The company was restructuring, needed to rejuvenate the workforce, had to reduce costs of older personnel. Bobby, with his senior salary and age, represented an insurance risk and a barrier to innovation. Brian delivered these phrases in a mechanical tone, as if reading from a manual. Then, finally, he looked Bobby in the eyes and said his last day would be Friday. 5 days. 35 years of impeccable work erased in 5 days. Bobby felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't so much about losing the job. He was retirement age, though he would have preferred to continue. It was the humiliation, the cold and impersonal manner, the total absence of recognition for everything he had given the company. He asked if there was any possibility to reconsider, if he could at least finish the year. Brian shook his head with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The decision was final. There was already a young mechanic ready to take his place, graduate in mechanical engineering, fresh from specialization courses. The future, according to Brian, had no room for dinosaurs. Bobby left that office with trembling legs. He crossed the facility in silence, ignoring colleagues' questions. He sat on his stool next to bus 147, and for the first time in 35 years, he didn't know what to do. An older colleague, Tom, approached with 2 coffees. He was 60 and knew his turn would come soon, too. They sat in silence, drinking bitter coffee, watching young mechanics who had no idea what was happening in the upstairs office. Bobby thought about his wife, Linda, who had died 3 years earlier from cancer. The facility had been his refuge after that loss. His kids were grown with their own lives. What would he do now? Sit at home watching television? Wait for time to pass? But there was something in those still burning eyes, something Brian Caldwell hadn't seen. Bobby Martinez wasn't the type who gave up easily. And in the following days, while Brian celebrated his restructuring with investors, Bobby silently began planning something that would change everything. The 5 days passed in a flash. Bobby continued working with the same dedication as always, finishing started jobs, silently training younger colleagues on tricks he'd learned over decades. Friday evening, when he left the facility for the last time, there were no parties, no speeches, only silent handshakes and misty eyes. Brian didn't even show up. He was in a meeting with investors, probably showing charts demonstrating how cutting older personnel costs would improve profit margins. Bobby returned to his empty apartment in Mesa, a tidy 2-bedroom where every object had its story. Photos of Linda everywhere, memories of a life together. He sat on the couch and for the first time allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. But Bobby wasn't a man who let himself be defeated. Linda had taught him that life hits you, but you have to get back up, always. So, Monday morning, instead of staying home ruminating, Bobby did something unexpected. He went to visit the old owner, Mike Sullivan. Mike lived in a house in Scottsdale, enjoying a golden retirement after selling the company. The two had always respected each other, and Mike was happy to receive him. They drank coffee in the garden while Bobby told what had happened. Mike shook his head bitterly. He knew Brian Caldwell had always found him arrogant and short-sighted, but the investors had wanted him, promising miracles of efficiency and growth. Mike said something that struck Bobby. The company he had built over 40 years had become unrecognizable in just 6 months. Brian had cut costs everywhere, fired experienced personnel, replaced quality parts with cheap alternatives from China. Customers were starting to complain. Buses broke down more often, but short-term numbers looked good, and that was all that mattered to investors. Bobby listened carefully. An idea was taking shape in his mind, still vague but insistent. He asked Mike if he knew anything about contracts Phoenix Metro Transit had with the city of Phoenix and private companies. Mike, intrigued, shared what he knew. The biggest contract, the one with the city for public transportation, was expiring in 6 months. It was a $15 million a year contract. Phoenix Metro Transit had held it for 20 years, but it had to be renewed through competitive bidding. And with recent service unreliability, it wasn't guaranteed they would keep it. Bobby left Mike's house with lots of information and an idea that was becoming clearer. He spent the following weeks very methodically. First, he made a complete inventory of his resources. He had life savings, about $300,000. He had severance from Phoenix Metro Transit, another 100,000. He had his house, fully paid off, worth at least 400,000. But above all, he had something no capital could buy: 35 years of industry knowledge, an impeccable reputation, and a network of contacts that included practically every mechanic, every supplier, every city official who dealt with public transportation in Phoenix. Bobby started making discreet phone calls. He called Tom, his old colleague, who had just been fired by Brian, too. He called 3 other senior mechanics who had been restructured in previous months. He called his trusted parts supplier, a man who'd been in the business for 40 years. He even called a lawyer specializing in commercial law, an old-school friend. To each he asked the same question: if there was an opportunity to start over, to build something new based on quality and not just short-term profit, would they be interested? The answers were all positive. There was frustration in the industry, anger at how Phoenix Metro Transit was deteriorating, a desire to prove that experience and quality still mattered. Bobby spent 3 months building his plan. He woke up at 5 every morning and worked until late evening. He studied bid requests, analyzed numbers, prepared business plans. He used all his savings to consult experts, lawyers, accountants. And then, quietly, he founded a new company, Metro Services Phoenix, a small bus maintenance and management company, initially with only 5 employees, all ex-Phoenix Metro Transit, all fired by Brian Caldwell. Bobby rented a small warehouse in Tempe, a few miles from Phoenix Metro Transit. It was old, needed work, but was functional. With his colleagues' help, they transformed it into a modern facility in a few weeks. Their first client was a small private transportation company that had had problems with maintenance done by Phoenix Metro Transit. Bobby solved the problems in a few days, with much lower costs and superior quality. Word of mouth started spreading. But Bobby had a much bigger goal in mind: the city contract. He knew Phoenix Metro Transit was struggling, knew customers were dissatisfied, knew the city was looking for alternatives. So, 4 months after being fired, Bobby submitted his bid for the tender. It was a bold bid: competitive prices, superior quality guarantees, a team of mechanics with decades of combined experience. When Brian Caldwell received the news that Metro Services Phoenix had participated in the bid, he laughed. Who were these people? A ridiculous startup with a generic name. They didn't even have the means to compete. But Brian had underestimated 2 things. First, how damaged Phoenix Metro Transit's reputation was after his months of optimization. Second, who really was the founder of Metro Services Phoenix. While Bobby silently built his alternative empire, Phoenix Metro Transit was imploding. Buses started breaking down with alarming frequency. Young, inexperienced mechanics didn't have the knowledge to prevent problems before they became catastrophes. Bus 147 broke down completely 3 weeks after Bobby's departure. The transmission failed, blocking traffic on Van Buren Street for 2 hours. The repair cost was $45,000, what Bobby had prevented for years with $3,000 maintenance. The cheap Chinese parts started failing systematically. Belts, batteries, brakes. Drivers complained. The union pressured. The city received more and more complaints. But Brian dismissed everything as,
enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
resistance to change. Meanwhile, Bobby worked with precision. Metro Services Phoenix grew solidly. Every job perfect, every customer satisfied. He had also convinced 2 former Phoenix Metro Transit executives to join as consultants, offering company shares. Suddenly, he had not only the best mechanics, but expert management too. When evaluation time came for the city contract, the technical committee knew Phoenix Metro Transit's problems well. Brian's bid was arrogant. High prices, empty words, no real guarantees. Metro Services Phoenix's bid was detailed, specific, realistic. It listed every Phoenix Metro Transit problem and explained exactly how to prevent them. And when officials saw who was behind it, Bobby Martinez, the legendary mechanic, along with the veterans Phoenix Metro Transit had thrown away, everything changed. The technical evaluation was overwhelming. The city knew these men would keep their promises. When Brian received the news that Phoenix Metro Transit had lost the city contract, he thought it was an error. Then he saw the name, Bobby Martinez. The old mechanic fired 6 months earlier for being too old. Blood froze in his veins. $15 million a year, 40% of revenue, lost. The loss of the city contract was like pulling the plug from a dam. Everything Brian had built on numbers and optimizations started to crumble. Investors were the first to react. They called an emergency meeting. Brian tried to reassure them, to explain it was just a temporary setback, that they would recover with other contracts. But the numbers were ruthless. Without the city contract, Phoenix Metro Transit was deep in the red. Then came the chain reactions. Other clients, seeing that the city had chosen Metro Services Phoenix, started asking questions. Some private companies that had contracts with Phoenix Metro Transit started renegotiating or seeking alternatives. Metro Services Phoenix was growing rapidly, fueled by the city contract and positive word of mouth. Bobby had to hire more mechanics, rent a bigger warehouse, purchase equipment, but he did it wisely, always with an eye on quality and long-term sustainability. Meanwhile, Phoenix Metro Transit continued deteriorating. Brian started firing more staff to contain costs, but this only made things worse. Remaining mechanics were overworked and demoralized. Many started looking for work elsewhere. Some sent resumes to Metro Services Phoenix. Bobby was selective. He didn't hire everyone. He wanted people who shared his philosophy: quality work, respect for the craft, dedication. But for good mechanics, Phoenix Metro Transit was losing. There was always a place in his company. 6 months after losing the city contract, Phoenix Metro Transit was in deep crisis. Investors were losing patience. Accounts were disastrous. Clients were leaving. Reputation was in pieces. Brian Caldwell, the CEO with the Stanford MBA, who had arrived 6 months earlier full of confidence, was now a desperate man. His optimizations had proven to be optimizations only in Excel sheets, not in reality. He had underestimated the importance of experience, deep knowledge, relationships built over decades. Investors started looking for buyers, but who wanted to buy a company in free fall? Negotiations were difficult. Potential buyers offered ridiculous prices. Phoenix Metro Transit, worth $100 million a year earlier, was now worth maybe $20 million and dropping. It was in this context that Bobby Martinez made his final move. He had carefully followed Phoenix Metro Transit's situation. He knew investors were desperate. He knew Brian was teetering. He knew the company was about to be dismembered and sold for parts. Bobby had built significant capital with Metro Services Phoenix. The company was now worth about $10 million. He also had access to bank credit, thanks to his reputation and solid contracts. And he had allies. Mike Sullivan, the old owner, was willing to invest. Other industry entrepreneurs who respected Bobby were interested. Bobby put together a consortium. The goal: acquire Phoenix Metro Transit, merge it with Metro Services Phoenix, and create a larger, stronger company based on principles of quality and respect for workers. The offer was presented to investors: $25 million for the entire Phoenix Metro Transit. It was more than other offers had proposed, but much less than investors had hoped. But did they have a choice? The alternative was watching the company fail completely, losing everything. After days of difficult negotiations, investors accepted. Bobby Martinez returned to the Phoenix Metro Transit facility on a Tuesday morning in July, exactly 8 months after being fired. But this time, he wasn't wearing faded blue coveralls. He wore a sober but elegant suit, and he didn't enter through the employee's door. He entered through the main entrance, accompanied by lawyers and Mike Sullivan. Brian Caldwell was still formally the CEO, but only for another 24 hours. The next day, the acquisition would be completed, and he would be out. Investors, as part of the deal, had already accepted his resignation. The meeting between Bobby and Brian was brief and icy. It took place in the same office where, 8 months earlier, Brian had fired Bobby with arrogance. Now roles were reversed. Brian, pale and visibly shaken, tried to maintain a last semblance of dignity, but his gaze avoided Bobby's. Bobby felt no satisfaction from revenge. He wasn't that type. He looked at Brian and saw only an arrogant young man who had learned a painful lesson: that numbers on Excel sheets don't tell the whole story, that experience has value that can't be quantified, that respect for people isn't weakness, but strength. The next day, Bobby gathered all remaining employees in the facility. There were about 50 people, half the original workforce. They were tense, scared, not knowing what to expect from the new owner. Bobby spoke without a microphone, without a podium. He stood among them, in his old blue coveralls he'd put back on for the occasion. His words were simple and direct. He said the company had been devastated by wrong decisions, but could be rebuilt. He said work would be hard, but fair. He said experience would be valued, not punished. He said anyone who shared values of quality and dedication was welcome. Those seeking shortcuts and quick profits at quality's expense should leave. There was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with older mechanics, those who had known Bobby for years. Then it spread to everyone else. It was applause of relief, hope, recognition. In following months, Bobby put into practice what he had preached. He rehired experienced mechanics who had been fired. He invested in training for younger ones, not just technical, but mentoring with veterans. He replaced all cheap Chinese parts with quality components. He restored the preventive maintenance program that had always worked. It wasn't easy. There were difficult months, problems to solve, debts to repay. But Bobby had a long-term vision. He wasn't seeking quick profits. He sought to build something solid, sustainable, that could last another 35 years. Slowly, the company's reputation began rebuilding. Clients who had left started returning. New contracts arrived. Efficiency improved not because costs were cut, but because work was done right from the start, avoiding costly emergency repairs. 2 years after the acquisition, the company, now called Phoenix Metro Martinez, was profitable, growing, and recognized as an industry leader for quality and reliability. Bobby, now 67, still worked in the facility every morning, though he had hired a young CEO, one who had worked from the bottom up, who knew the business, who respected people. Bobby Martinez turned 70 in a facility full of impeccably maintained buses, surrounded by colleagues who respected him not for his title, but for who he was. Phoenix Metro Martinez was now the reference company in the Southwest, with contracts in 4 states and an enviable reputation. But for Bobby, true success wasn't measured in balance sheets. It was measured in the faces of young mechanics he was training, transmitting to them not just technical skills, but a work ethic, pride in the craft, respect for older colleagues. Brian Caldwell, after being fired from Phoenix Metro Transit, had found work at another company, then another, but his reputation was tarnished. People in the industry knew what had happened. They knew he had destroyed a solid company through arrogance and short-sightedness. No major company wanted to hire him as CEO anymore. He now worked as a freelance consultant, helping tech startups with growth strategy. He was still convinced his methods were right, that the failure had been due to resistance to change from older employees. He had learned nothing. But in the real world, far from PowerPoint presentations and Excel sheets, Bobby had proven something fundamental. That experience matters. That respect for people isn't sentimentalism, but good business. That long-term quality always beats short-term optimization. Mike Sullivan, the old owner, often visited the facility. Seeing how Bobby had not only saved but transformed the company he had founded, he felt his life's work was in good hands. He often sat with Bobby over coffee. Two old men who had seen the world change but remained faithful to principles that had always guided their lives. One day, a young journalist from a business magazine came to interview Bobby for an article on successful family businesses. He asked what was the secret of his extraordinary success, how he had managed to take over the company that had fired him. Bobby thought for a moment, hands still dirty with grease, despite now being the owner. Then he said something simple but profound. He had simply continued doing what he had always done. Work well, respect people, not seek shortcuts. The difference was that now he had authority to ensure the entire company followed the same principles. The journalist seemed disappointed. He was looking for a more dramatic story, a hidden secret, a brilliant strategy. But Bobby smiled. The real secret was that there was no secret, just hard work, integrity, and patience to build something of value instead of seeking quick profits. That evening, Bobby returned to his apartment. Linda's photos were still everywhere. He spoke to her mentally, as he often did, telling her about the day. He knew she would be proud, not for the money or success, but because he had remained true to himself. He sat on the couch with a beer, looking out the window at Phoenix's lights. He thought about everything that had happened in recent years. The humiliation of being fired, the difficult months building the new company, risking everything he had, the triumphant return. But most of all, he thought about a lesson he had learned and now taught young people. That age isn't weakness, but strength. That experience is a treasure no Excel sheet can quantify. That respect is earned through decades of honest work, not PowerPoint presentations. And that sometimes, when they throw you out the door for being too old, the best thing to do is build your own door, and then buy the entire building. Bobby smiled, finished his beer, and went to sleep. Tomorrow he would have to wake up early. There were buses to maintain, young people to train, a company to grow. At 70, Bobby Martinez wasn't thinking about retirement at all. He still had too much to give. And in the facility that now bore his name, the blue buses of Phoenix Metro Martinez were perfectly aligned, ready for another day of impeccable service. Every bolt tightened correctly, every engine purring perfectly, every detail cared for with the experience of someone who knows quality isn't a cost, but an investment. Because Bobby had proven what Brian Caldwell never understood, that sometimes the people you consider too old are exactly those who can teach you the most about building something lasting. Like if you believe experience is worth more than an MBA comment if you've ever seen someone underestimated because of age, share this story of silent revenge and deserved triumph. Subscribe for more stories proving justice eventually comes. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so beautiful, so solid, so right, that they can only watch and realize what they threw away. And Bobby Martinez did it with hands dirty from grease and a heart full of dignity.